Chapter 2, Administrative and Management Overview. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about some of the first steps at the point that you initially received your award from ADFA, and also talking about some of the administrative requirements that are surrounding that. So the initial process, at the point that ADFA makes their funding decisions, you would receive a award notification. This is not your grant agreement. This is a notification that you have been selected to receive an award of home funds. There may be some special conditions that would be a part of that award notification, maybe some things that you need to do prior to being able to finalize that agreement. So it's also at the point where the environmental review process will begin. That environmental review record will be put together, and ADFA will take that through the process to receive a release of funds for that project. We'll talk later in modules about the other federal requirements, including the environmental review, but just know that projects are not able to go forward until that environmental review has been completed. Once the environmental review process has been completed and that release of funds has been received for that project, then the home agreement will be issued. We'll talk more about what's included in that home agreement. Basically, this is the document that lays out the terms and conditions for those funds that you receive. That includes the home regulations, the ADFA specific requirements, and other federal requirements that go along with that. Your home written agreement might also have some special terms and conditions that would be specific to that project. They become part of the guidance that's being provided for you as part of that award, but they will also be part of compliance, not only during the development period, but also during a long-term compliance period. So important to know what's in that home agreement and understand those requirements. Once this process has been completed, ADFA will issue to you a notice to proceed. So until that notice to proceed has been received, you're not able to begin that project. So important to know when that has been issued by ADFA. Some initial steps on getting that project set up. You will need to provide a DUNS number before funding. That's part of what ADFA is required to include when they're setting up the projects within IDIS. So you'll hear us use this term IDIS a number of times. That stands for Integrated Data Information System. And that essentially is the system that HUD uses to collect project information. This is the system through which ADFA would request their reimbursement for funds that have been expended, and where all of the data that's collected over time will be submitted. So for instance, as you are funded for a rental project, the rental project will be set up within IDIS, showing where that's going to be, how many units, the other funds that are part of that project. And then once the project has been completed, IDIS will track not only its completion, but the affordability period, and will be entering into IDIS, or you'll be submitting to ADFA, and they will enter information about the occupancy for that project. This is the way that ADFA is reporting to HUD, showing how they're using the money, the current status of projects, and then everyone that has been served as part of the final outcome of that project. Once this has been completed, the project's been set up in IDIS, you also would need to have your pre-construction conference. Now, this is where you're going to be bringing together the partners, the contractors as part of this project, and talking through those requirements that apply to this specific project. So some of those things that are included in the home agreement, be talking about lines of communication, timelines that are expected, making sure that each of the partners understand their role through the different periods of the development, for this project so that we get off to a good start with folks understanding what the expectations are. Some of the things that have been found over time to be really critical to successful projects, one of those is readiness. So, once you're receiving that funding, being ready to be able to actually start that project. So having your plans in place, having policies and procedures, knowing who's going to do what needs to be done first, having, those internal and external processes in place. We'll talk more about that as we go along. Also, some system of accountability, so specific roles for folks, some oversight by the different partners in that process. That includes things like some timelines. So when you expect things to be done, how you expect those to be reported, inspected, those become really critical parts of that process. And of course, a lot of this is going to really depend on the quality of and the knowledge of the folks that are going to be implementing this. One of the reasons for ADFA putting in place this training and the certification process was to try to make sure that recipients had the required knowledge of the rules and requirements that apply to these funds and were ready to be able to take on these projects. So making sure that the hiring has been completed, that those key staffing folks are in place, that a system has been organized. Folks understand what their role would be in this process. Part of that is also oftentimes dependent upon our partners, whether that's a developer, whether that's a consultant that's been hired in, or another, maybe a nonprofit that's part of the development plan. Making sure that you choose carefully those partners and make sure that they have the appropriate skills and understand their role in the project. So part of making sure that we're ready to roll on these projects is having policies and procedures in place. So I'll give you a couple of simple examples on this. Let's say you were funded to run a homeowner rehabilitation program. You would need to be thinking about how am I going to solicit applications? What will my process be in determining who is going to be eligible for that? Who will do the inspections? And what standard does the house need to be brought up to? How do we make decisions on this? And so policies in place setting those standards on what the expectations are, and procedures laying out who's going to do what, when, using what tools would be part of that. So really having a plan of action and having identified the roles of your team that are going to be taking on those specific roles. We need to make sure that we advertise our programs appropriately. So one of the key missions of the HOME program and our other federal programming is to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to access the resources, the services that are being provided with these funds. So needing to make sure that you're adequately advertising your program within your local service area to make sure that all of those that might be eligible for participation would know about that, would know how to access that program, and specifically what they need to do, what the parameters would be for that program. As part of that, we're also trying to make sure that we're using very strategically the limited funds that are available. So in many cases, we're going to have more demand than we will have funds available. So, part of your local program design, some of the design in laying out the ADFA program were made based upon trying to make sure that with the funds that are available, that we would get the most effective use, most effective outcomes on that. So some of the things that affect that are thinking about who's my target audience, what are my restrictions going to be on income? Am I going to have some priorities within that? So for instance, if I was running a homeowner rehab program, I might have funding enough to do maybe 10 houses, but I might have 30 households apply for assistance. Part of your policies and procedures is thinking about how will I make those decisions? Will I be funding households based on who is found to be eligible first, so order of applying and providing all the documentation that might be necessary, or am I going to have some priorities, maybe based on the needs of the unit we're looking at, or based on we set priorities for maybe families or elderly or something. So thinking about how do we make the most strategic use of the funds that we have available. And we'll be talking about things like leverage funds, match funds. Part of this is trying to bring other folks to the table, partnering them with our home funds to try to make sure that we make them go as far as possible in addressing our local housing needs. ADFA, in trying to help you, I'm trying to simplify the process of running a home program, has put together standard documents, standard forms and templates for you to be able to use. These forms provide the information that's needed, a format that'll give you good documentation, trying to make this easier for you. And you'll note as we go through the different modules throughout this training that for the most part at the end of each one of our sections, there'll be a slide that will talk about the forms that are provided. All of these are on the ADFA website and are made available for you, and really are encouraged, in some cases required, to use those standard documents so that we know that we're going to have that correct and have appropriate documentation in place. We'll also be talking later in the training about state procurement law. So we have a whole overlay of other federal and state regulations that apply to the implementation of our home program. And those become really critical to make sure that in the end we're going to have an effective program, but we're also going to be in compliance with all of the regulations that impact our program. Part of your role as the recipient of home funds is to make sure that you're overseeing that project, and that is critical during the construction period. So as construction is going along, we're making sure that you're on site, that you are checking in on that project, not only to make sure that it's moving forward and going to be on schedule, but also that the work that's being completed is in line with the specifications, that it has been done in the correct way, you're getting a quality product as part of that. Once our projects are put in place, many of our projects will also have an affordability period. So we'll be talking later in this training about the requirements for you as the recipient of the home funds during that affordability period. Some of that will be captured in a written agreement that you would be executing with a recipient of the project. In the case of a funding for development of, let's say, affordable rental housing, your written agreement will contain a lot of information about the requirements during that period. So talking about things like making sure that units are going to be affordable. So restrictions on rent and utility that our households are going to be paying, making sure that we have income eligible households, that our units are maintained appropriately during that affordability period. Another key factor is having effective financial management. So we're going to have, in many of our projects, a mix of funding sources. The home funds certainly come with some requirements that go along with them, but so will many of the other sources of funding within that project. The PJ and its sub-recipients and partners need to be able to track the money coming into the project, the payments that are going out, the specifics about what that expense, how that related to the project, specifically what we were paying, what was our fair share. And we'll talk more about that later within the training. At the end of that project or throughout the project, you need to make sure that you have adequate records in place to be able to document that you have taken the required steps to show the due diligence that you've done throughout that project, and to make sure that this project was eligible, that we had eligible beneficiaries, that our project was completed and built to our standards. So a lot of record keeping and having some systems laid out on the front end of the project of what we're going to collect and when we're going to collect it become really critical for the success of our project. The thing that oftentimes is kind of left behind on projects is evaluating at the end of that project or program of how effective was this. Are there some things that we want to improve? Are there things that we want that worked really well for us? So it's taking a little bit of time to evaluate the effectiveness, think about the policies and procedures, the team that was involved in that project, and evaluate that so that for the next undertaking, that some of those lessons learned can be applied as you move forward. So let's talk a little bit about what it will take to have your project ready so that you're eligible to draw home funds. So before you're eligible for a fund disbursement, we mentioned that that environmental review process must be completed. The release of funds would have been received. Your closing documents would be finalized. So you have that written agreement in place. It's been fully executed. There is a standard setup form for IDIS, Integrated Disbursement Information System, and this essentially provides, you would be completing that and submitting that to ADFA. That gives them all the information about the project that's needed, so they're able to go into the IDIS system, set up that project, commit the money to that project, and have it set up so that once that project needs to draw money, it's already been identified in the system and is essentially ready to roll. We mentioned earlier about having that pre-construction conference is really critical on getting off on the right foot, everyone understanding the requirements. And then, of course, key is to remember that before you can proceed with that project, you need to have received that notice to proceed that will be issued by ADFA. Let's talk a little bit about the ADFA policies on reimbursement. So as part of your written agreement, the reimbursement timeline will be spelled out in your written agreement. Now keep in mind with the federal dollars, these are based on reimbursement. So once you have incurred a cost for completion for a portion of the project, you would be seeking reimbursement with ADFA. They will be drawing funds through the IDIS system, which is why we have to have it set up in advance so it's ready for that process to be completed. You are not eligible to reimburse expenses that you have incurred prior to receiving your award. Other things to keep in mind, there is a retainage that is going to be held back from each of the draws throughout the project. That retainage is released 30 days after the final inspections have been completed on the project. So really the purpose of the retainage is holding back some amount of money so that in the case where you have difficulties, there are things that need to be corrected on the project, that essentially you have a little bit more control because you're holding back some additional money on that project. So we're not going to release that final retainage, which is accumulative from all the draws in the project, until that final inspection has been completed. We know that everything has been addressed, and then 30 days after that's been completed, that final payment would go to the vendor for that project. Any balances that are not utilized for that specific project would be released from that commitment and would go to other eligible activities or be returned to ADFA to be dispersed elsewhere. Now, some rules that apply for the home program itself, there's a maximum of 10% of your annual allocation that can be used for administrative and planning costs. And we're going to define what those are. So this is a rule that's applied by HUD to ADFA in the funding that they're receiving, and they must then pass that on to all of the recipients who are using those funds. So under admin and planning costs, these are all the sort of general management, monitoring, coordination, the sort of public information, fair housing issues, and then generally all the other compliance with other federal requirements. So if we had Davis-Bacon labor standards that were triggered, it'd be the oversight on implementing those labor standards, making sure that they were appropriately paid for. So this includes, this cap that's put in place by HUD is covering not only what ADFA is doing, but also what a recipient of those funds is held to. Now, related to that are how we reflect some of those costs. So staff costs are one of the labor costs are one of the larger administrative costs for the home program. We have a couple of options on how those could be reflected. If we had a staff person who 100% of their time was related to the home program, so they did not work on other funding sources, they were only working on one grant, then we could charge off their entire salary towards this specific grant. And we would have a job description that would line up, that would show that, yeah, what this person does is all specific to the home program. In many cases, we're going to have folks that will be working, you might be working on a couple of different awards that are open. So you might have some older funds you were finishing up, and maybe you have a new award that you're also working on. You also might be working on some other public or private funding sources that were have been received by that recipient, and so we need to be able to break out that staff time for each of those funding sources based on the time and the duties that they are undertaking for the time that they're spending. So you would need to have a timesheet that would show the hours that were worked, and then within those hours be able to break that out across the different funding sources and be able to charge that off. So for instance, if I was, if I was working, let's say with both CDBG and home funds, I would be reporting on a daily basis on my time and activities report. I would be showing, I came in at 8 o'clock, I left at 5 o'clock, I spent 4 hours working on the home program, I spent 3 hours working on NSP and a couple of hours working on something else. So you'd be able to chart that out, and that's how those costs would be reflected and build off to the different funding sources. So we mentioned a slide or two ago that we have both administrative and project costs. And for some of the costs that are being incurred under the home program, some of those are eligible in either category. So if we have costs that are directly related to a home project, they generally can be billed up either as a project expense, so they would be not part of that 10% cap that we have on administrative costs, or they could be charged off, they'd be eligible as an administrative cost, but they would have, begin to accrue towards that 10% limit that we have on admin funds. So things like if I was having appraisals done or work specifications completed, the inspections, the time that you might be on site on a project that's under construction, underwriting, and then with some of the other federal requirements. So we might have a project that we had displaced someone, and so we were going to be working under Uniform Relocation Act, which I think we'll mention under the other federal section. If we were doing home buyer an activity Homebuyer counseling is also required. So that would be eligible as a project cost. Now, the key to being able to charge something off to a project cost versus admin is that we need to have enough documentation to be able to know that it's related to a specific project. So let's take the work specifications and construction inspection as an example. So if my function with the home program was doing the inspections, let's say we're running a homeowner rehab program. If I'm going to do the initial inspections of those units that we're going to assist, write up a scope of work, create work specifications that are going to be used as part of our bid packets for those projects. And then I'm also going to be the person that as they request draws or as I do my ongoing inspections, I'm going to be going to that site and inspecting the work that's being completed. If I'm tracking my time specifically to that address, then that could be eligible to be charged off to the project. So I would have to then have a timesheet that showed for each of my days. You know, I was on site at a particular address, and so charging off that time, I would be keeping track of when I return to the office, if I'm spending some time working on developing those work specifications. I would also keep track of that and the address that it was related to so that those costs could be charged off directly to that project as opposed to coming out of our admin funding. And that is one of the ways to conserve that limited amount of admin that we have available to us. So as we mentioned, they have to be tracked to the project. We'll talk a little bit later in our activities. We have a requirement that we have a maximum amount of home assistance that can go into any specific unit. So for instance, if my limit was, let's say $100,000 in maximum subsidy limit, and I had in hard construction funding $95,000 for that project, I would have to make sure that as I'm charging off my inspections and other things that I'm not going to exceed that maximum subsidy limit. For a lot of our projects, we tend to be quite a ways below what the actual federal maximum subsidy limit is, so that may not be an issue, but it is something that does apply. Also keep in mind, and we'll be talking about in a later chapter, talking about the federal requirements for match. So there's a 25% match requirement, and that's for our project funds. So as we charge off some of these administrative implementation costs to our project, it's going to raise what that project cost is, and so it will raise the amount of match that's going to be required. So something to keep in mind and think about as you're moving forward. If we have a project that does not actually go forward, so for instance, if I had a homeowner rehab program and I went out to inspect a unit and I spent some time coming up with a scope of work and doing my internal estimate on how much that was going to cost, if I found that the costs for bringing that unit up to standards were going to exceed what my maximum limits were for my program, that would be a unit that I would end up not assisting. So I can't charge off that time as a project cost because I'm not going to have a project. So I would have to, if I had initially charged it off to that address, if that project doesn't go forward, those costs are going to have to be backed out of my charge off for a project and will have to be moved to come out of my administrative cap on that. Also, any kind of expenditure that's being incurred by the project owner that we're seeking reimbursement on, that's always going to be considered a project cost. The admin funds are being used by that state recipient or subrecipient to cover their costs for implementing the program, but a project owner, that's going to be a project cost. So switching gears a little bit on this, and this is kind of an overlay so we have the home regulations we've been talking about, maximum subsidy limits and some of these requirements, but we also have the federal uniform administrative requirements. So the Office of Management and Budget has created circulars that have now been consolidated into a single guide, and these are referenced as the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. As I mentioned, they've all been consolidated now into, and they are found at 2, and this is CFR, which is Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. And those are, sometimes they're called the Super Circular or Omni Circular. A lot of times you'll hear people simply say Part 200. These are the federal requirements that apply not only to home, but many other federal programs, many or all. One thing to note here, and we'll talk further when we get into later module, but we'll be talking about community housing development organizations. CHODOs is what we are calling them, and they're sort of a set aside within the home program that are not considered, if I'm funding a CHODO, they are not considered to be a state recipient or subrecipient, so they don't fall under all of the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements. We only have one subset of the Uniform Administrative Requirements that actually apply for CHODO funding, and that's found at 24 CFR 84.21. So a much smaller subset. We'll revisit that when we get to the CHODO section. So let's talk a little bit about our written agreements. I mentioned that once that award notification had occurred, and the environmental review had been completed, that written agreement is going to be executed between ADFA and the recipient of those funds. Might be a developer who's going to be putting and implementing a project, or it might be a state recipient who's actually going to run a local program. So the written agreement, as I think I mentioned before, becomes part of your sort of management tool of knowing what are my requirements, what is the timing requirement on this, what are the expectations that I'm going to be held accountable for. So it's part of helping to clarify the roles and responsibilities. This is the document that will be used by ADFA or HUD or other entities in enforcing those program requirements. So it's spelling out what you're required to do, and that will be the legal document that all discussions or issues will go back to in resolving who is responsible on that. So it's put in place by ADFA to make sure that they're protecting the investment. You in turn would be putting written agreements in place with an assisted. So if I assist a home buyer to be able to purchase a home, you're going to be executing a written agreement with them. And as part of that agreement, you'll be spelling out, what the roles and responsibilities are, the requirements that apply to that house, and the affordability period that will also be part of that. Having that written agreement in place is part of setting up that project, committing the home funds to the individual project. And some of that information gets plugged into IDIS in setting up the ADFA commitment of money to a specific use. So that written agreement is going to be essentially required for anyone that's receiving funds. So you as the recipient of the funds, a contractor, a developer, owner-sponsor developer that's receiving funds to be able to develop a project, but also that individual household that's receiving assistance, whether it's tenant-based rental assistance or home buyer assistance, housing rehab money. Essentially, every end user and the partners along the way are going to have a written agreement in place that'll be specific to the requirements that apply to them. We'll be talking a little bit more about what goes into those agreements, and luckily ADFA has also provided you sample templates which essentially have the correct elements as part of that. So there are some home-specific required things that need to be included in those written agreements. So the use of funds, that agreement needs to lay out for the funds that you're receiving, how are they expected to be used, what's the, who is the target recipient of that. All of those regulations would be a part of that. Also the affordability that's going to go along with that. And we're going to talk as we get into our individual activities that are home buyer, our rental activities, will have a long-term affordability requirement. And so that would be spelled out within that agreement and when that affordability period will begin and when it will end. Also, some standard language about reversion of assets, program income requirements. So if home fund has been used to purchase assets, there would be some reversion language that would allow you to essentially pull that back. Program income, in this case, program income we'll be talking about in just a little bit, is going to be going back to ADFA, and so that would also be spelled out within your written agreement. We mentioned before 2 CFR Part 200, that's the Uniform Administrative Requirements. That's going to be spelled out within that written agreement. And that language is going to be different depending whether this is a state recipient, subrecipient versus if it's going to a developer or a CHOTO. And we're going to have some different language based on who that written agreement is being completed with. And then, of course, all the program requirements that are specific to either home, or they might be an ADFA requirement, or they might be a local program design requirement that you've put in place. We would be capturing that within our written agreement so all parties understood what the requirements would be, what the restrictions would be. And part of that will include some of those other federal requirements, things like affirmative marketing, fair housing, also the steps on how you expect a party to request disbursement. So in a contractor's written agreement, there would be language about how disbursements will be handled. And then, of course, all the records and the reports on what needs to be retained, for how long, those sorts of requirements would be put in place. There are enforcement provisions which spell out the responsibility for that, and that's part of what will be used by HUD or ADFA or you as a state recipient who have provided funding to someone else to make sure that those enforcement provisions were put in place so that if you have to take action with noncompliance, that you have a way to be able to do that. So some key things about good written agreements. Well, they're clear. They clearly lay out the roles and responsibilities. This is one of your ways of communicating your expectations on that. So laying out what those standards are, what the expectations are, that includes things like timing and reports, protocol. So, things like if I have a change order, what's the process on this? Can the contractor simply say, oh, let's change this and I will simply bill for it? Or is there a requirement that they come back through the funders essentially on this for permission? These are where some of these expectations and standards would be put in place. This is also where, again, the program requirements are spelled out clearly so we understand who can live there, what the requirements will be, how long those requirements will be in place, what's the protocol on reporting on this. These are living documents, so over time, if there are changes, those documents will need to be amended. And so if you let's say as a developer found that you needed to change the number of designated units, or you had let's say you had a budget shortfall and additional money was being brought in for the project, that agreement, which outlines all of the budget, all of the program requirements, would need to be updated to appropriately reflect what that project would be. And in many or most cases, will have to be reviewed and approved to determine, is that something that's going to be in compliance with the home and the ADFA requirements on this. And it is something that you would use and the different partners would use as a management tool to go back to and check, let's see what was the requirement that was put in place for this. Some of the ineffective written agreements, when the home program first came about, they were looking for written agreements, and many people simply turned to the Community Development Block Grant Program, CDBG, or other programs they had in place and simply borrowed one of those agreements. So if they don't have the right home requirements and the right regulatory references, then they're not going to be effective. Also, anytime we have either conflicting regulatory references or we just have vague language in our written agreements, it's going to cause them to be less effective. The more that we can clarify on the roles and the responsibilities of all the parties and have that in clear, understandable language, that's going to be really critical. And there's sort of a balance between having enough detail and too much detail. If we spelled out everything in excruciating detail, they'd be gigantic and no one would read them. So being somewhat strategic about particularly areas that there's been confusion on or non-compliance over time, those areas may need to be expanded a little bit and talked through a little more clearly to make sure that all parties are going to understand that. And then again, the enforcement requirements become really important. If you've ever had a project where you didn't get what you had contracted for, and then you look back to that written agreement and to try to hold that party accountable and find you don't actually have the enforcement information, or you don't have enough detailed information to be able to document that they're out of compliance, that's an ineffective written agreement. So we want to make sure that they are very clear and understandable. Switching gears a little bit, we want to talk a little bit about conflict of interest. So recipients need to comply with conflict of interest requirements, which are included in both the uniform financial requirements, the 2 CFR 200, but also there are provisions within the home regulations. And essentially under conflict of interest, we're trying to make sure that there's not a conflict with folks that either are going to be benefiting or have some kind of monetary or other kind of interest in the project. This not only applies to a state recipient, but also would apply to a developer, to a CHODO, who are receiving home funds. So within the home regulations themselves, the conflict of interest references are at 92.356 Part F. There are some cases in which a conflict or a perceived conflict can be identified and be waived, but it must be done in conjunction with ADFA, and in some cases ADFA will actually have to go to HUD and seek permission. So for instance, if I was running a, let's say I was running a housing rehab program in my local community, and I had an income eligible elderly person who was applying for the project, but had a relationship, maybe this is the mother of, let's say, the housing inspector who's working with the home program. That creates a conflict of interest because they essentially, the person who would be making a decision on what needed to be done and whether that house appeared to be eligible would have an interest or a relationship with the applicant. In a case like that, it may be that we would be able to remove that inspector from working with this specific project, so identifying the conflict, coming up with a way to work around that, and then after seeking written permission, be granted that by ADFA to be able to go ahead and provide assistance to this otherwise income eligible individual. So we have to keep an eye out for conflict of interest and know that there may be times when you need to either not work with a particular vendor or an applicant, or that you would need to be seeking permission in writing from ADFA. There also are state of Arkansas conflict of interest rules that are going to apply. So as part of your application process, recipients must disclose state officials or employees that have either a position of power or have an ownership interest of 10% or greater. And this also applies to third parties that are participating in the home-funded project. Within the application and within the standard ADFA forms, there's a contract and grant disclosure and certification form in which would need to be signed and disclose any potential conflicts of interest. There have been questions over the years about religious organizations and am I able to provide federal dollars to a religious organization? HOME does, and clarified this a number of years ago, does allow you to provide funding to a religious organization. There is a requirement, though, that there cannot be any discrimination based on religious preferences on who could actually live in the units or receive the service. And it also would have a restriction in place, so you can't require those individuals to participate in some way in inherently religious activity. So, you couldn't have a, let's say you developed rental housing. You couldn't only, and your sponsor was a church, you would not be able to only market those units or give preference to members of that church or folks that were actively participating in their religious activities. That would be considered discriminatory action. So we mentioned before a little bit about program income. Let's talk about the definition of that. So program income is income that's being generated by a home-funded project. And this is where we've used home funds or we have a matching contribution. We'll talk about match later, but we might have other sources in the project that are considered a permanent contribution to affordable housing, which is how we're able to count them as match. If we find that we have income generated from those, that's going to be categorized as program income. So an example would be if I have a home-funded project and I have, maybe I have in place a loan with the developer, those payments that are coming back from my home funds are going to be considered program income. For the Arkansas program, all program income is going to be returned to ADFA. ADFA is required by HUD to track and report their program income. It essentially holds its federal identity so that home program income will have to be reused for another home eligible project. All of those other federal requirements, the labor standards, environmental review, all of that will continue to apply to those funds. And they also get reported in IDIS, all of the same requirements as our home funds when we initially utilize them. So just keep in mind, all program income is going to be returned to ADFA. Recaptured funds, a little bit different of a category. So we'll be talking when we get to the home buyer section about when we assist households, particularly using our recapture methodology, that if a unit was to be sold or transferred prior to the completion of that affordability period, there's a requirement that money has to be paid back. So this is essentially the affordability period wasn't completed, so we have to pay money back because we don't really have a completely eligible project. So that amount that is going to be paid back, it's not considered to be program income because that project hasn't fully met its requirements by completing that affordability period. So the home rules themselves do allow 10% of that to be set aside for administrative and planning costs. So for managing program income, as I mentioned, all program income is going to come back to ADFA, and ADFA will be handling redistributing the program income, reporting within IDIS. So the purpose of program income within IDIS is to make sure that we are able to track the program income that was receipted and then be able to show that it was reused for an eligible usage. So all of the information that we are standardly collecting for a home project, who the beneficiary was, the project that was committed to, all of that gets reported into IDIS. It's essentially deposited back into Arkansas's line of credit and then committed to another project. So it's really kind of working like your checking account. So for ADFA on working with IDIS, what they're doing is setting up each of the projects. So ADFA receives an annual award of funds. With that award, they're making funding decisions on projects and subrecipients that they are going to provide funding to. So they will be going into the IDIS system and setting up those individual projects and committing money out of their award of funding. So they're subdividing that and budgeting it for specific projects. With that setup process, as I mentioned earlier, with the form that you're filling out, they're reporting in all of the needed information about how these funds are going to be used, where, the affordability period, who the partners are, leveraging of other funds, all of that. At the closeout or the completion of the project, they will also be then reporting on the final numbers, reporting information about each of the recipients, and all the demographic information about those. So there are forms that you are required to utilize. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a setup form that you would be filling out and providing to ADFA, which they'll be using as part of their setting up that project in IDIS. There's also then a closeout form at the point that that project has been completed, that again, you would fill out the closeout form, submit that to ADFA, and they will be going in and finalizing that project within IDIS. We'll be talking about, when we get into the individual activities, some of that process. So in Chapter 4 through 7, you will see as the attachments for those chapters that those setup and closeout forms would be part of that process that we'll be talking about. So other administrative requirements, keep in mind that there is a specific process for approval authority. So we mentioned things like the startup of your project. You're going to be waiting to get a notice to proceed that comes from ADFA. We'll be talking later in this training about sign-up authority and things like change orders. We mentioned that with a conflict of interest, if you were requesting a waiver to be able to proceed, those sorts of things. There's a protocol on when you have to go to ADFA and be able to seek information on that. There is a criminal background check that's further detailed within this chapter. ADFA does have the ability to suspend your award. So with certain violations, failure to implement, or non-compliance with your written agreement, ADFA does have the authority to be able to suspend your agreement until you meet certain terms and conditions. And there is a requirement for an audit to be completed based on standard government audit procedures to be able to track the money and be able to show that it was used appropriately. So here's our, as I mentioned, there'll be a list of ADFA forms at the end of each process. So some of the standard forms, the contract and grant disclosure and certification form that we mentioned about with conflict of interest. And we also mentioned the IDIS setup and completion forms, which will be done on the front end and the back end of each of your projects. And here's the standard, the linkage to go to on the ADFA website, where you'll be able to download these forms. Many of them are fillable forms, so they become really important tools for you in completion of this process.